Father in heaven, we thank you for this day of rest that you've given to us, and we thank you for giving us a land that has become influenced by Christianity to the point where we can be given this rest. And we ask that we would not abuse this gift that you've given to us, but as we think about it today, we would understand it better and fulfill your desires for us. We pray in Christ's name, amen. Well, we are today at the fourth word of the 10 words. And that puts us still in Exodus chapter 20 and in verse 8 and following. Let me read it from the New American Standard Bible translation, and then we'll look at it in a little bit more detail. And the Sabbath commandment is complex, and we're not going to do more than just start our consideration today. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of Yahweh your God. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your man servant or your female servant or your cattle or your sojourner who stays with you. For in 6 days Yahweh made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore Yahweh blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. This is unlike the commandment we looked at last week. It doesn't require us to make large alterations in the translation to bring out the sense. We're used to, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. And we had to retranslate that, you will not lift up God's name in vanity, because the idea of taking God's name is just associated in people's minds with cussing, and that's really not the idea at all. The idea is lifting up in worship and in bearing God's name, being called a Christian in all of life, and you will not do that in an empty fashion. But today, the translation is pretty straightforward. Remember the Sabbath day to guard it or keep it holy. Like the second commandment, this one has 3 phrases. The second commandment, or second word, remember these are not commandments, they are never called that in the Bible, they are called the 10 words. The second commandment had an initial statement, you shall not make for yourself a graven image. Then it had a large expansion of that statement, and then it had a rationale. And here we have the same structure. Remember the Sabbath day to guard it holy, and then what does that mean? Well, in this context, it's expand it. 6 days you will labor and do all your work, for the seventh day is the Sabbath of Yahweh your God. You shall not do any work in it. You, your son, your daughter, your manservant, your maidservant, your cattle, your sojourner who is in your gates. How many people are listed there? Yes, you're right. And of course, that's always in the book of Exodus. Everything's in sevens. So, you, your son, your daughter, your manservant, your maidservant, cattle, and sojourner. 7 things. You'll notice that the wife is not mentioned. She, of course, must work and does never get a day of rest. No, that's not the proper interpretation. And then we have a rationale. For in 6 days Yahweh made heavens and earth, the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Because of this, Yahweh blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. This is a tough question, trick question, but there's something peculiar about that last statement, that Yahweh made the heavens and the earth. Can anybody explain to the class what's odd about that? Or what's striking about it? What's new about it? Bob.
Well, Genesis 1, it says Elohim did. And now we're given the name of Elohim that did it. The covenant-keeping God is identified to be identical with that.
Right.
El Shaddai or Elohim that was in Genesis 1.
Right. Right. Genesis 1 says God did this, God did that, and you don't get the expression Lord God, Yahweh Elohim, until you get to Genesis 2 and the creation of man. And, of course, liberal scholars try to make a big deal out of that, as if this was the Elohim passage comes from the P source, and then the Yahweh God section comes from the J source. That is an idea dreamed up about 150 years ago by the apostates in the German church who said God didn't write this, but it was made up by men, and then it was conflated from a bunch of sources. And obviously, people in the ancient world could not have used more than one word to describe their God, and so every time you have a different word, that means you have a different theologian. Just like today. If you say Jesus, then you never say Christ, right? If you say the Lord, you never say Jesus, right? So if you say God, you would never say Lord. So that's what they figured people were like in the ancient world, and that's an example of the stupidity of liberalism, that people would ever even take something like that seriously. What they do, boy, and they still do too. Any commentary you get, and half of them by evangelicals, will pay lip service to that idea. Well, we don't buy it. And here you see we can set aside all of that and say that Yahweh here at Mount Sinai, He's given this name, it's His memorial name, and He tells the people, just in case you didn't understand it, I am the Elohim that made heavens and earth to start with. The God. And the word Elohim means what? Who remembers from the first commandment the kind of general idea behind the word Elohim? Why is it that angels and men are called Elohim as well as God?
Elohim's a plural noun.
Yeah. Leader, what does Paul call it? Powers that be. That was what we said would be a good way to think of Elohim. The Elohim are the powers that be. And you will not have any of the other powers that be in the face of the ultimate power that be. There are other powers God has made and given power and right to rule. But none of these are ever to be set before the true Creator God, who is a totally different order of existence and power from these images of His, the lesser Elohim. So that's what's going on, and Yahweh identifies Himself. So that's interesting. You'll notice how the covenant name comes in here. And that reminds us again the Ten Commandments were given in a particular historical situation to a particular people. And if we want to interpret them, we can't just pop them out of historical context and assume that they were timeless information dropped out of heaven without any historical context. And here we get to the Sabbath day, and it's going to be important to look at context again. But before we look at context, let's look at text. And today that's as far as we're going to get. First of all, the text, we'll look at the basic command, remember the Sabbath day to keep it or guard it holy. The guarding idea goes back to Genesis 2. Adam is supposed to guard the garden. Eve is in the garden, so he's supposed to guard her. And he doesn't guard her. The older brother is always supposed to guard the younger brothers. Cain says, am I my brother's guardian? After he murders him. The answer is yes, you're the older brother. You're supposed to guard. You don't. And guarding is an important idea. And here we're supposed to guard the idea of the Sabbath day. Guard it or keep it holy. Keep doesn't just mean obey. It means to respect and guard in a much broader sense. First thing it says is remember. Now that tells us to remember, but remembering in the Bible very often, much more often than any other time, implies God remembering or reminding God. And that's what it means to make a memorial, or when God sets up a memorial. It is to remind Himself. He tells us to take the Lord's Supper as a memorial. We are to do it as a way of reminding God to keep the covenant. The Lord's Supper is a dramatized prayer by which we remind God to keep the covenant until He comes, and He comes right away and gives us bread and wine. And so the ritual of doing the Lord's Supper reminds God and asks Him to come, and He answers immediately and comes and gives us bread and wine. And that reminds us that He will come in much greater ways in the future. So when it says remember the Sabbath day, the use of this word, instead of saying keep the Sabbath day, guard the Sabbath day, do the Sabbath day, rest on the Sabbath day, by using the word remember, God calls to their minds the idea of worship. Worship is very much implied. So does the word holy. Guarding it as holy also is going to imply worship. So occasionally you'll hear people say, well, worshiping on the Sabbath day, that's an extra idea, but the basic idea is just taking the day off. No, it's not. The basic idea is worship. And the use of the verb remember implies that. Use this as a day to memorialize God, to remind God. You remember and you remind God. It's a day for remembering on both sides. Now the word Sabbath, remember the Sabbath day, the basic meaning of Sabbath seems to be to cease or to stop. And I say seems to be because if you were to look up the word in Hebrew, it would say probably related to the verb to cut off or to cease or to stop. But there's question about that. The answer to the question is always, there isn't any other word that it seems to be related to, and so this seems to be it. And it's pretty obvious that is. God stopped His work on the seventh day, and so the basic meaning of the Sabbath as stopping makes sense, and then takes up broader and more pregnant connotations from what you are stopping from and stopping for. You stop from a certain kind of work in order to engage in something else called rest, and all of these are broad ideas. And so We'll take the word Sabbath as meaning stop or cease. Then it says, you will guard the day as holy. And holiness implies worship, and we kind of instinctively know that. But now we need to think about holiness for just a little while and look at how that's unpacked in Deuteronomy. But we won't get Deuteronomy right away. What does holiness mean? Well, the word holy or holiness has a root idea of being separated. But it's dangerous to just take that root idea by itself, because if we say that God is holy, that means He's separate from everything else. Then how do we explain the statement, you be holy as I am holy? The idea in holiness is really the idea of integrity and maintaining boundaries. God is holy, and so God has a boundary around Himself in the Old Testament, and you don't cross that boundary without being in trouble. The boundary is guarded by Levites and priests. There's a series of boundaries marked out by a series of veils, and in the temple then a series of doors, paneled doors, with cherubim on them, who are the guardians of this holiness of God. And really the best word in English for holiness is integrity. A person has integrity means he becomes himself. And the more integrity he has, the more unique he is, and at the same time, he can engage in relationships with other people. For us to have holiness means that we're to have true integrity. And in the Bible, there are all kinds of parallels between violating God's holiness and violating the holiness of a human being. Human beings have houses, and in the Old Testament, those houses have boundaries. And if you cross that boundary, you have violated the holiness or integrity of a person. If a dead animal comes inside that boundary and dies and leaves its carcass on your food, well, that becomes unclean. Once a year, you have to take all the area inside that house and take all the old leaven out of it. In this house of yours, you have a hearth fire, just as God has a hearth fire in His house. And on the Sabbath day, God's hearth fire blazes real high because extra sacrifices are put on it. And so on the Sabbath day, your hearth fire is to die down real low. And you're forbidden to stoke up your hearth fire on the Sabbath day, as we'll see. And so your house has integrity. And there is moral integrity. If somebody breaks into your house at night, you don't know why he's doing it. If you kill him in the dark, there's no blood guiltiness because he's violated that boundary. But then adultery destroys the holiness and boundary of a marriage. And if you take the food of unclean animals into your body, you violate the integrity or holiness of your body. And so all these different spheres of things have holiness or integrity. They have boundaries around them. And that's the idea. Now, if something is holy to the Lord, that means it's included in that boundary circle around Him. It's included in. You say, God is holy means He's separate, but we're separated off along with Him. We're included in that circle. In the Old Testament, there were a whole series of circles, but to be holy to a certain degree is to be inside of one of those circles. Now, keeping the day holy means keeping it holy to the Lord, keeping it within a special sphere of nearness to God, and thus implies worship. And we see it clearly made out in Leviticus 23, verse 3. This is a verse that's often overlooked. And chapter 23 of Leviticus corresponds to the fourth commandment in Leviticus. The third commandment, carrying God's name in holiness, takes up from chapters 17 to 22. The second commandment, having to do with mediatorial access between man and God, runs from chapters 11 to 16. And the first commandment, having to do with the uniqueness of God, is the first part of the book. This really begins the Sabbath section, and all of chapter 23 has to do with worship. But it starts here, verse 3, for 6 days work may be done, but on the seventh day there is a Sabbath of complete rest, a holy convocation. And these are virtually synonymous. They're put in apposition to one another. A Sabbath of complete rest, a holy convocation. You shall not do any work. It is the Sabbath to Yahweh in all your dwellings. Now that business of having a Sabbath in your dwelling was going to connect to the idea that your hearth fire is not to be stoked up because God's hearth fire is. And so it's observed in your dwellings that way. But you see, it says that it's going to be a holy convocation means that it's going to be a worship service. And this is the origin of the synagogue. Now you will hear that Ezra invented the synagogue after the return from exile. The synagogue really developed in the intertestamental era, and so when we get to the New Testament, we find the synagogue structure with the president of the synagogue and certain officers, and a ritual that was used every Sunday that comes into the early church and becomes part of the traditional ritual of the church that you would see in a Lutheran worship book or something like that. It goes back to the synagogue and a lot of the basic form and structure of it. Well, it's probably true that Ezra reformed and set the pattern for the synagogue that we see in the New Testament. But the idea of meeting every Sabbath day in your towns and in your villages starts here. And so we find later on in Deuteronomy it says, remember the Levite who is in your town. We find in the book of Judges that there are these Levites who are going from town to town as pastors of local churches. And we find that once the remnant covenant is set up, because in the northern kingdom all the faithful Levites moved south to the kingdom of Judah because they were persecuted by Jeroboam. And so another covenant is set up in the northern kingdom that we can call the remnant covenant, and the pastors are called prophets. And after they go to the school of the prophets, which was the seminaries, then they go out as pastors of local churches. And Jezebel kills them all, and only Elijah is left, and God tells Elijah to go back and start another seminary, and sure enough, a few years later, we have another school of the prophets, and they're building a building for them to be in. Remember the story of how they're working on that building, and the axe head falls in the water and is made to float back up, because that's what's going on there. Well, these are pastors. The Levites are pastors. When they're taken out of the way, the prophets become pastors. When Ezra comes along, there are very few Levites who come back from exile. Lots of priests, but few Levites. And the prophetic movement is on. We don't see this in the Bible, but it's Josephus and others who tell us that Ezra set up the synagogue structure we see in the New Testament with an elected series of elders and a president of the synagogue and a teacher and all that kind of thing. And then that comes into the church. Every Sabbath day this was to go on. Bible study, teaching, preaching, prayers, but no sacraments. Because the sacrament is when you eat the sacrifice, and that took place only at the tabernacle. And so in the Old Testament, the service of prayers and teaching was in the synagogues, and the service of sacraments was at the temple. In the New Testament, these things are put together in the church. We have both. In the Old Testament, they were kept separate for the most part. At least when the tabernacle and temple were standing, it was that way. The point here is the Sabbath day is a time you have a holy convocation, with what that implies. In studying other passages, we see it implies reading and studying the Bible, being taught it. The lips of a priest and of a Levite teach knowledge. At your holy convocations, the word is to be read, so forth. It's very similar to what we have today. So what does it mean to keep the day holy? It means to go to the holy convocation. Now, there are other kinds of convocations in the Old Testament, some for war, some for electing kings. Kings were always elected in the Old Testament. Always elected the Davidic king in the south, but they had to approve of the new kings. Remember when Rehoboam came to the throne after Solomon, all Israel came together to approve of it. When he wouldn't release them from bondage and slavery, the 10 northern tribes made an exodus out of the Egypt of Rehoboam, and with God's blessing. And as soon as they got out of the Egypt of Rehoboam's kingdom, they set up golden calves, which kind of recapitulates the history that we already looked at over the last several months. But the people, the nation, had a decision, had a right to make decisions there. That was not a holy convocation, that was a political one. So keeping the day holy is expanded here. We see if it wasn't clear to us, it would have been clearer to them, knowing the Hebrew language and having a feel for these words, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, they would have understood what that meant, go to church. In case it's not clear to us, we can see it in Leviticus 23. And we can also see it in Deuteronomy, and now you better look there. Deuteronomy 14, 21b starts the section dealing with the fourth commandment. And continues to chapter 16, verse 17. And I want to kind of show you the structure of this. Last time we looked at the third commandment in Deuteronomy, and you remember Deuteronomy is laid out one commandment after another. And we will glance at it as we do the 10 Commandments, because this will fill us in to a degree on the meaning of each one of these. Well, what we'll see here in Deuteronomy is that the idea of keeping the Sabbath means gathering at the festivals and paying your tithes, that kind of thing. That's what keeping it holy means. And you'll see there that the stress in the Bible itself is not on don't engage in any activities. The stress is on worship and festivity, setting aside your work for that purpose. 21b says, you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. And because that follows on the laws regarding food, it's often grouped with them. And of course, the versification in your Bible does that, doesn't it? We have these laws about the animals that you may eat and ones you may not eat, and it says you may not eat anything that dies of itself, verse 21. And then it says you will not boil a kid in its mother's milk. And it kind of looks like that's a food law, but you'll notice it doesn't say you will not eat a kid boiled in its mother's milk. It just says don't do it. Plus, this statement in the middle of the verse, for you are a holy people to Yahweh your God, is the closure of that section. And now this would get real complicated, and when we get to the statement on boiling a kid in his mother's milk in Exodus 23, we will take the time to look at it and find out what it means. But here I'll just tell you what it means. It basically means don't seize for yourself the things that belong to God. And there's a perversity here of taking a kid and boiling it in its own mother's milk. And the two times we see that happen in the Bible, we see it happen with human beings. All animal laws refer to people. Animals symbolize people. And so when Samaria was invested, it says that these women agreed to kill their children, and they say, well, one woman says, well, we killed my son and boiled him up and ate him, and now she's hidden her son and won't let us boil him up and eat him. It's the same word. And then later on, Jeremiah in Lamentations says that people boiled their kids and ate them. And so the references here are really to human beings. And as I say, we'll get into more detail there. It's related to tithing. And this section of Deuteronomy has two parts. The first part will start with the kid law. And the second part starts in chapter 15, verse 19, and gives the positive form of it, and that's the firstborn law. Chapter 15, verse 19, you will consecrate to Yahweh all the firstborn males that are born of your herd and of your flock. You shall not work with the firstborn of your herd, nor shear the firstborn of your flock. Now, what happens afterwards? Well, the kid law gives us a law of tithes, which are brought in, and it gives us a law of Sabbaths. That's what follows it. The law of the firstborn is followed by laws concerning festivals. And that carries us down to 16:17, which returns us back to the theme when it says, every man shall give as he is able, according to the blessing of the Lord as he has given you. Right after it says 3 times a year all your males will appear before the Lord, which of course is a Sabbath gathering idea. And then look at verse 18. Of chapter 16. You shall appoint for yourselves judges and officers in all your towns. Have we moved beyond the 4th commandment to the 5th? Honor your parents? Obviously so. That's very obvious boundary there. We have moved beyond the idea of gathering for worship into the idea of setting up rulers, fathers and mothers over the nation, which we will look at when we get to it. Well, let's just read this through here and see what Moses tells them in connection with keeping the Sabbath day holy, guarding it. What does it imply? And look at all the things that are mentioned here. We won't look in detail, just read them over and pick them up. And we'll start. You will not boil a kid in its mother's milk. As I say, that's cryptic to us. It was less cryptic to them. This is chapter 14, verse 22. You shall surely tithe all the produce from what you sow, which comes out of the field each year, and you shall eat in the presence of Yahweh your God at the place he chooses to establish his name, the tithe of your grain, your new wine, your oil, the firstborn of your herd and of your flock, in order that you may learn to fear Yahweh your God always. And if the distance is so great for you that you're not able to bring the tithe, since the place where Yahweh your God chooses to set his name is too far away from you when the Lord your God blesses you. In other words, when you get blessed, you're going to spread out, and some of you will be living far away from the tabernacle. Verse 25 says, then you can exchange it for money, and bind the money in your hand and go to the place that Yahweh your God chooses, and you can spend the money for whatever your heart desires, for oxen or sheep or wine or strong drink. That means beer. Wine or beer. It doesn't mean distilled spirits. From what we know, they didn't have the technology for distilling spirits in the ancient world, but it would mean brewed. Fermented drink is wine, brewed is beer. Or whatever your heart desires, and you will eat in the presence of Yahweh your God and make merry. Guess you would. You and your household. And you will not neglect the Levite who is in your town, for he has no portion or inheritance with you. At the end of every third year, you will bring out all the tithe of your produce in that year and deposit it in your town. It would seem to imply that after you go to the feast and spend the money for the festival, then the tithe is brought back, what's left over, which will be most of it, and deposited in your town, in your gates. And the Levite, because he has no portion or inheritance among you, and the sojourning stranger, the orphan, that's not literal, the fatherless. Orphan in the Bible is not necessarily motherless, but is always fatherless. So we have to translate that carefully. The fatherless and the widow who are in your town, in your gates, shall come and eat and be satisfied, in order that Yahweh your God may bless you in all the work of your hand that you do. Well, notice this has to do with festival times. That's how we know we're involved with the Sabbath. And what does keeping the Sabbath holy mean? Well, one thing it means is paying your tithes. And using that tithe to pay a salary for the local Levite, who is your pastor and teacher, and taking care of aliens, refugees, Haitians, whatever, fatherless, widows, people that, especially in that kind of a society, do not. 10%. A tithe in the Bible is not what you decide you dedicate. It's 10%. God establishes the percentage, not us. And, of course, as Malachi says, if you don't give it, you're robbing God. If it's something holy and you rob it, you're really in trouble. It's one thing to steal something ordinary. It's another thing to steal something holy in the Bible. So be careful about tithing. So this is part of the Sabbath law. At these festival occasions, you turn in 10%. And you tithe on your grain, your wine, and your oil. Why are those things mentioned? What do the grain, wine, and oil have in common? What sets them apart? Set apart means holy, so what makes them holy? Those are the three things used in the sacrificial system. You have oil in the lampstand. You pour oil over all your cereal offerings. Your cereal offerings have to be baked with oil. Then, of course, there's the libations. The wine is sitting there in its flagons on the table of showbread. And then the grain that you make the bread from. And then herd and flock are the two sacrificial animals. The only thing not mentioned is a tithe of turtle doves and pigeons. But you see, people didn't usually raise turtle doves and pigeons domestically like they would chickens. You kind of had to catch them so you wouldn't tithe on them. But these are all the sacrificial things. Does that mean that if you have a lot of broccoli and you're growing broccoli, you don't have to tithe on it? I don't think so. Because it starts off, you will surely tithe all the produce from which you sow. But what's highlighted are the things that are particularly associated with God and have a certain degree of holiness. And you see, even in your own house, because it's a copy of God's house, you've got to keep these things separate. You have an olive yard and a vineyard, and you have a field. The Bible says you may not plant field plants in your vineyard. You will not plant your crops mixed. And the specific thing that's mentioned is you will not plant grain in your vineyard. When we do the Lord's Supper today, we're going to have the grain, and then after everybody's finished having the grain, we'll have the fruit of the vine. We keep them separate. In the Old Testament, they were always kept separate. Blood and flesh are always separated in the sacrificial system. So you see, that kind of separation is there, and the grain, wine, and oil are the three things that are taken in the tabernacle. And the New Testament does it as well, you see. We're very familiar with bread and wine, but remember, if you're sick and you want to be anointed, it'll be olive oil that you're anointed with. So those are still the three vegetable things that the New Testament as well as the Old sets aside for special use. So you see, we're in the Sabbath zone here in the tithing. If you want to know what it means to keep the day holy, then it's the day you bring your tithe. Well, then he goes on, and then it's obvious that we're dealing in the Sabbath area. In chapter 15, at the end of every Sabbath years, you grant a remission of debt. So, at the end of every 7 years, you grant a remission of debt. This is the manner of remission. Every creditor shall release what he has loaned to his neighbor. He shall not exact it of his neighbor and his brother, because the Lord's remission has been proclaimed. From a foreigner you may exact it. I think that the word behind that is the unconverted foreigner, not the converted one. But we will get to this in Exodus where it's found there, and we'll look at the details then. But your hand shall release whatever of yours is with your brother. However, there shall be no poor among you, since the Lord will surely bless you in the land which the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance to possess. If there will be no poor, if only you listen obediently to the voice of Yahweh your God, to observe carefully. My Bible has a split infinitive there, to carefully observe. We'll correct that. To observe carefully all this commandment which I'm commanding you today. For Yahweh your God shall bless you as he has promised you, and you will lend to many nations, and you will not borrow. You will rule over many nations, but they will not rule over you. Now, every Sabbath year, you release the debts. And since you release the debts, that means anybody that is in debt bondage, who is in servitude paying off a debt, is also released. So that becomes a time when debt slaves or debt servitude is remitted. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that in the 8th year you start collecting it again? Some people have argued that. I don't think it does. I don't think there's any evidence of that. I think it means that if you haven't collected the debt by the 7th year, you forget it, and God will make it up to you. And the man who owes the money gets to start afresh in a new week of years, and that is the gift to him of rest and a new start that God gives him in connection with the Sabbath. But you'll notice here that in discussing the Sabbath here in Deuteronomy, Moses, under divine inspiration, preaches about letting people go free. And that's important to the book of Exodus, because in Exodus, remember, we start in bondage, we move to freedom. We're working 7 days a week, building Pharaoh's cities in chapter 1. At the end of Exodus, we've built the city of God, the tabernacle, and we get to rest 1 day out of every 7. In fact, in the Old Testament calendar, there are 80 feast days. And there is one fast day. You add them up, 52 Sabbaths, the whole week of unleavened bread, the first day of every month, which is a rest day, the 8 days of tabernacles, the day of Pentecost. Add them up, there are 80 festival days, 80 holidays in the calendar. And there's one fast day, which is the Day of Atonement. So God has given them a lot of rest by the time we get to the end of the book of Exodus. We move from slavery to Sabbath. And here that is Moses' stress as well. You've been given rest, so you give rest. You've been given freedom, so you give freedom. Your debts were released, so you release your debts. It's okay to exact it for the 6 years, because a person who goes into debt should pay it off. It's good for him to have the discipline of trying to pay things off. But if God in His providence keeps him from being able to, then you forgive it in the Sabbath year. Verse 7 goes on, if there is a poor man with you, one of your brothers, in any of the towns in your land which Yahweh your God is giving you, you shall not harden your heart nor close your hand from your poor brother, but you shall freely open your hand to him and generously lend him sufficient for his need in whatever he lacks. Beware lest there's a base thought in your heart saying, the 7th year, the year of remission. That's kind of close to the cutting off idea. The Sabbath year is near. Don't think that. And don't let your eye become hostile towards your poor brothers, so that you give him nothing, lest he cry to the Lord against you, and it will be a sin in you. You shall generously give to him. Your heart shall not be grieved when you give to him. Because don't give begrudgingly, in other words, but hilariously. Because for this thing Yahweh your God will bless you in all your work and in all your undertakings. For the poor will never cease to be in the land. Oh, here we have a contradiction in the Bible. Look at that. It says the poor will never cease to be in the land, and it just said, there shall be no poor among you. Well, let's go home. It says there will be no poor if you perfectly keep. But we know that that's not going to happen. So there'll always be some poor. The poor will never cease. That was a Sabbath idea there. The poor won't cease. And so give them the Sabbath ceasing of the Sabbath year. The poor will never cease to be in the midst of the land. Therefore I command you, saying, you shall freely open your hand to your brother, to the needy and poor in your land. Well, now, what does it mean to keep the Sabbath day holy? What does it mean to see to it that those that you have power over get rest? You see, it goes on. You shall not do any work, you or your son, daughter, manservant, maidservant, or even animals, or even the foreigners. They're all given rest. And as we'll see, giving rest is the main idea. And we're building up to that here. Giving rest means loaning money to those who need it and not requiring it back. because God will make it back to you if the person isn't able to. God will make it back to you by blessing him, and he'll pay you back. If that doesn't work, God will make it back to you some other way, so you can be generous. That's what it means to keep the day holy. That's what being a Sabbatarian means. Then it says in verse 12, if your kinsman, a Hebrew man or woman, is sold to you, that's debt slavery. He's so far in debt, he can't make it up, so he says, I'll work it off. There are different kinds of slavery in the Bible, and we'll look at them when we get into chapter 21 of Exodus a year from now. But no, it won't take that long. But this is debt servitude. He will serve you for 6 years, but in the 7th year you set him free. And when you set him free, don't send him away empty-handed. Furnish him liberally from your flock, and from your threshing floor, and from your wine vat. And give him some sheep so that he can give a sacrifice. The sheep is the central sacrifice in the sacrificial system. Everything else goes from that. First time we see the sheep is a substitute for Isaac. And the sheep is the one used at Passover. And the sheep is the one used for the trespass offering, which is the offering that deals with sins, real sins, not just impurities, high-handed sins, deep original sins. You use a male sheep. That's the central one, and then you expand upward to bulls and downward to birds. But here you give him some sheep so he can sacrifice, and so he can get started in business, and you give him from your threshing floor so that he can have bread and bring a cereal offering. And you give from your wine vat so he can bring the libation offering. Because you see, when you bring a sheep, you've also got to bring the bread, and you've also got to bring the wine in the sacrificial system. And then you can have a party. If that's a peace offering, and it will be, you'll get to eat part of it, and you'll get to eat part of the bread. And when you go home, you can drink some of the wine. You can't drink the wine in the presence of God right at the tabernacle in the Old Testament. So you give him this stuff. As the Lord your God has blessed you, you help him get going in his business. And you'll remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. Therefore I command you this today. Well, what happened when we were in Egypt and God set us free? Did we go out empty-handed? No, we spoiled the Egyptians. They gave us all kinds of stuff. They gave us gold, silver, and precious stones, and they gave us all kinds of animals. People were coming around to us at night saying, here, take this stuff, please. No more plagues. So when you set your servant free, you as an image of God, due to that slave that you're setting free, the same thing God did to you when you were set free. That's what it means to keep the Sabbath day. Give him his exodus. Verse 16 says, it shall come about if he says to you, I don't want to leave, because he loves you in your household, since he fares well with you. Then take an awl and pierce it through his ear into the door, and he will be your servant forever. And also you shall do likewise to your maidservant. Now that we'll look at again. I keep saying we will. And of course, these are all going to come up in Exodus. Let me just explain that to you now. That's the idea of an adoption. It doesn't say, I want to stay with you because I'm just irresponsible. It says, I want to stay with you and become attached to your house. And so you adopt him by a ritual of circumcising the ear. This is called in the Bible a circumcision of the ear onto the doorpost of the house, and he becomes what the Bible calls a home-born slave, or literally a house-born slave, and he becomes an adopted son. And see, these are two pictures of how God deals with us. On the one hand, he sets us free. On the other hand, because we love him, he adopts us into his household. And you have to take both of those images and put them together to see the theology of it. We can't deal both ways with another human being. We can't both set him free and adopt him into our house. God can do that, but we can't do that. So we either set him free or adopt him into our house. And that's the idea. That's what it means to keep the day holy, to give rest to others. And here's a man, you see, all the Israelites were agriculturalists. But are all of you? How well would you do if you were a farmer? I don't think any of us would probably do very well. Some of us might find that we have the skills to do it, or to be a husbandman, but most of us probably wouldn't. So here you are, you spent years trying to get your farm to work, and it just hasn't worked, and you wound up in so much debt that you went and became a slave, a bondservant, in the large household of a big landowner agricultural combine. And of course it was nice there, and you weren't abused, and you were paying off your debts, and at the end of the time you say, and what did he have you doing? Well, he had you being an accountant, because you're good with numbers even though you're terrible with animals. And at the end of it, you say, I don't want to go back and try to be a farmer again. I'd like to stay here and be an accountant. And so if you look at the economics of this, it's very good, you see, too. People with certain skills will find a place within a larger household where their particular skills can be used. So that's part of this as well, and that's what being a Sabbatarian means. Hiring people when you can to help you with your work or set them free. Generosity. Verse 18 goes on, it shall not seem hard to you when you set him free. He's given you 6 years with double the service of a hired man. You haven't had to pay him, you see. So the Lord your God will bless you in whatever you do. And then it continues. Another Sabbath idea. Now we move to the second section for dealing with festivals and things you bring. This first section we've looked at deals with all the things you let go. You let go of your tithe. You let go of your servants. You let go of your money to help people out. Now we'll deal with the things you bring to Yahweh. And that's also a Sabbath idea. Verse 19 of chapter 15. See, we need to change all the chapter numberings here to make them fit these sections. That's never going to happen, but it would be nice. You shall consecrate to Yahweh your God all the firstborn males that are born of your herd and of your flock. You shall not work with the firstborn of your herd, nor shear the firstborn of your flock. You and your household shall eat it every year before Yahweh your God in the place which Yahweh chooses. But if it has any defect, such as lameness or blindness or any serious defect, you shall not sacrifice it to Yahweh your God. You shall eat it within your gates. The unclean and the clean alike may eat of it, as if it were a gazelle or a deer, which are non-sacrificial, clean animals that you can eat. Only you shall not eat its blood. You're to pour it out on the ground like water. Well, it's a Sabbath idea, thing given to God, one way or the other, or enjoyed under God's rules. Now we move straight to the festivals. Observe the month Abib, the month of ears of corn, and celebrate the Passover to Yahweh your God, for in the month of ears of corn, Yahweh your God brought you out of Egypt by night. You shall sacrifice a Passover to Yahweh your God from the flock and the herd. That's interesting. Where is a herd animal sacrificed at Passover? Well, it's part of the general sacrifices that go along with it, but it's always a Passover lamb is the particular thing that's eaten. In the place that Yahweh chooses to establish His name, you shall not eat leavened bread with it. 7 days you shall eat it with unleavened bread, the bread of affliction, for you came out of the land of Egypt in haste. Notice all these Sabbath ideas. You came out. Now you worship. In order that you may remember all the days of your life and the day when you came out of the land of Egypt. For 7 days no leaven shall be seen with you in all your territory, and none of the flesh which you sacrifice on the evening of the first day shall remain overnight until morning. That's one of the standard Passover rules. You got to eat it that night and burn up what's left. You are not allowed to sacrifice the Passover in any of your towns which the Lord your God is giving you. Now that may be a new thought to you, but see, you'll understand, once the tabernacle was set up, the sacrifices all took place there. They didn't ever do that house-by-house thing again. That was only once. Verse 6, at the place that Yahweh your God chooses to establish His name, you shall sacrifice the Passover between the evenings at sunset, at the time when you came out of Egypt. You shall cook it and eat it in the place your God chooses. In the morning you are to return to your tents. 6 days you shall eat unleavened bread, and on the seventh day there will be a solemn assembly, holy convocation to the Lord. You shall do no work on it. See, we're still Sabbath, but now we're talking about festivals. What is a Sabbath day? Well, we rest, we worship, we have festivity. Those are the three main ideas. Let's just quickly finish this up. You shall count, verse 9, 7 weeks for yourself. You shall begin to count 7 weeks from the time you put in the sickle to the standing grain. There's the 7, Sabbath. Then you shall celebrate the Feast of Weeks, or Pentecost, to the Lord your God with a tribute of a freewill offering of your hand, which you shall give just as Yahweh your God blesses you. You shall rejoice before Yahweh your God, you and your son and your daughter, and your male servant, and your female servant, and the Levite who is in your town, and the stranger, and the orphan, and the widow who are in your midst. How many is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8. Interesting. In the place that the Lord your God chooses to establish His name. You shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt. Be careful to observe these statutes. You got out of slavery and into Sabbath, festivity. You shall celebrate the Feast of Booths, tabernacles, 7 days after you have gathered in from your threshing floor and your wine vat. So the first feast was the Feast of New Ears of Corn, grain, and now the third feast is the Feast of Wine. Bread and wine, you never escape them in the Bible. So we're gathering in from the threshing floor and the wine vat here. both. And you will rejoice in your feast, you and your son and your daughter and your male servant and your female servant and the Levite and the stranger and the orphan and the widow. You, your son, your daughter, male servant, female servant, Levite, stranger, orphan, widow. There's 9 there who are in your towns. 7 days you celebrate a feast of the Lord your God in the place that the Lord chooses, because the Lord your God will bless you in all your produce and in all the work of your hands, so that you will be totally joyful. Now, to summarize, 3 times a year, all your males shall appear before Yahweh your God in the place He chooses, at the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Weeks, and the Feast of Booths, and they shall not appear before the Lord empty-handed. 3 times a year, the host of the Lord of hosts is gathered. The males have got to stand, march in review before the captain of the host, and they will always give a contribution at that time. Nothing in my hand I bring, simply to thy cross I cling. Here it says you will never appear empty-handed. Both are true. When we come to church, we bring nothing in our hand, but after we're forgiven, then we can bring ourselves and our tithes. Every man shall give as he is able, according to the blessings of the Lord your God that He has given you. That's the Sabbath section in Deuteronomy. A little bit different from what we usually think of, isn't it? But there's a lot of church tradition in this. Sunday is the day you go visit the poor. Sunday is the day you go visit old folks. It's the day you give things. It's the day you bring your tithe. It's the day you worship. It is our Feast of Unleavened Bread, Feast of Tabernacles, and Feast of Pentecost. So, that's for starters. Next week we'll continue with this and begin to expand. Now, what I want to summarize today, just immediately, and we'll see it more and more, the primary idea on the Sabbath is to worship God. The second idea is to rest from work, and the third idea is to engage in festivity. And it's in that order. Your rest must not interfere with your worship. Your festivity must not interfere with your rest. So each one of these will qualify the one that follows it. We don't want to engage in festivity that is so laborious that we're tired out. We don't want to rest so much that we miss church. And so that will be the structure, I think, that gives us a handle on practical aspects. But we won't get to that until next time. Let's close in prayer. Father, thank you for giving us this day of rest. Thank you again. Thank you for calling us out of Egypt and into your kingdom. And thank you for giving us a civilization that has been disciplined to some extent by Christianity, to where we do have at least a shadow left of a day of rest, and most of us are able to rest. And there is still some recognition in our culture of the need to rest 1 day in 7. We ask that you would revive our society and make these concepts more prominent in our midst. Help us to be generous toward those that need it and to live out the true meaning of keeping your day holy. We pray in Christ's name. Amen.